Thank you. May I begin by adding my thanks to our wonderful Chilean hosts and their partners for organising this very timely event. I think it's fair to say that looking back, in relation to fisheries, much of last century was spent in trying to deal with the gradual realisation that the earlier belief that high seas fisheries resources were inexhaustible was fundamentally wrong. UNCLOS established that the freedom of fishing aspect of the freedom of the high seas is now a heavily qualified right that is subject to the obligation to conserve and manage these resources and to cooperate with other states, including coastal states, in taking the necessary conservation measures. It's in fact only a conditional right. UNCLOS itself looked to the establishment of RFMOs as the best way to manage both high seas resources and transboundary fish stocks. But as most of the fish being caught were within what was to be the new 200 miles exclusive economic zones, the management of both straddling and highly migratory high seas stocks was not seen as a particularly big issue. That proved to be yet another underassessment of the risks to fish stocks. In the next decade, the overexploitation of straddling and highly migratory stocks reached crisis proportions, as Andres has indicated, and this led to the UN Fish Stocks Conference and the 1995 agreement. The whole point of the Fish Stocks Agreement was, in the light of post-UNCLOS experience, to develop and elaborate more effectively the relevant UNCLOS principles and thereby strengthen UNCLOS, which itself was already recognised as a major, ongoing and frankly irreplaceable contribution to international peace and security. Now, it seems entirely obvious that a high seas area cannot be managed effectively if straddling stocks are overexploited in adjacent EEZs. And it's equally clear that a coastal state cannot manage a straddling stock inside its EEZ if the fish stock is being overexploited on the adjacent high seas. But even with the 1995 agreement in place, RFMOs, a number of which predate that agreement, have had frankly mixed success in taking the tough decisions necessary to ensure that stocks and the ecosystems they inhabit are in fact being managed sustainably. In some cases, the decision-making processes appear to have been at least a significant part of the problem. For example, right now, as I understand it, we have a situation where the scientists advise that the stock of Pacific bluefin tuna is down to 4% of its unfished biomass, and yet the relevant RFMOs have not yet been able to take the hard decisions necessary to offer some hope that this appalling situation might be reversed. That's irresponsible and unacceptable. In my view, the chairs of these organisations are duty-bound by virtue of their responsibility to their respective organisations to find ways of publicly exposing those members who are effectively blocking the essential decisions and, if necessary, to initiate and lead a process of amending the organisation's decision-making rules. On a more encouraging note, 9 years ago, Chile, Australia and New Zealand recognised a major gap in the coverage of RFMOs and launched a process to establish the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organisation. This new RFMO is now in its third year of operation, and I join David in acknowledging the presence of the Executive Secretary here. One of its key features is its decision-making procedures. These provide that decisions should normally be taken by consensus, but if all efforts at consensus have been exhausted, then substantive decisions can be taken by qualified majority. But this is coupled with a unique and carefully limited objection procedure governed by strict time limits designed so that a clear and effective result is produced within the relevant fishing year. Now, in fisheries management, it's essential that all real interests are accommodated, and that's why all efforts must be made to achieve consensus. But consensus as the only means of taking a decision can have the unintended effect of providing every member with a disguised veto. In my view, we do well to remember that while it was the law of the Sea Conference itself that first emphasised the importance of making all efforts at consensus before resorting to voting, in the end, that conference had to vote, and we would not have the Law of the Sea Convention today if it could have been adopted only by consensus. In any RFMO, it's essential that primacy is given to scientific advice, and that advice must be publicly available so it's clear to the wider world if a conservation and management decision is inconsistent with that advice. A consensus-only rule on the adoption of conservation and management measures can provide cover for a member that is unwilling to exercise the restraint recommended by the scientists. In its short life, the SPRFMO Commission has had occasion to test both its objection and voting procedures on successive conservation and management measures relating to the main commercial species, jack mackerel. They were found to work effectively. Particularly encouraging in terms of implementing the fish stocks agreement is the fact that in each year the catch limits were set and maintained within the level recommended by the scientific committee. In my observation, the possibility of voting as a last resort changes the negotiating dynamics and increases the pressures to achieve consensus. And this is not just in relation to the negotiation of effective conservation and management measures. In my judgment, the possibility of a vote was an important element in the background to the Commission's consensus decision at its last meeting to place 2 vessels on the SPRFMO's IUU list. I believe the SPRFMO is now well-founded and will play an increasingly effective role, not just in relation to the conservation and management of the main commercial species, but also on the next order of related issues, such as seabird bycatch, appropriate marine protected areas, the climate change implications for the health of the oceans and the fisheries food chain, and perhaps more controversially, the working conditions of fishers. Like other RFMOs, it will need to continuously improve its means of ensuring that properly authorised and legal vessels catch only what they are authorised to catch. And here, with the encouragement of our moderator, I would like to announce or draw attention to the fact that in accordance with Article 27.3 of the SPRFMO Convention and the relevant conservation and management measure adopted by the Convention last February, from 24 August this year, the boarding and inspection regime in Articles 21 and 22 of the Fish Stocks Agreement is now in full force between contracting parties and cooperating non-contracting parties to the SPRFMO. I hope other RFMOs that have not yet done so may follow this lead. Even more importantly, provided the organisation is able to take advantage of the latest satellite technology, and I think that's a very important point, it is also well placed to continue its effective role in the ongoing battle to close down IUU fishing. Illegal fishing remains the scourge of the cooperative efforts of states to control the catches of their legitimate fishing companies, and in my view, threatens both the fundamental basis for flag state control and the integrity of coastal state EEZ jurisdiction. It simply must be stopped. And I think there's a real question whether the IMO should be asked to reconsider, just in relation to fishing vessels, the rules on flag changes, so that changes for legitimate purposes are not precluded, but changes cannot be made in ways that enable a vessel to obscure its identity and or escape jurisdiction. And finally, although key decisions may have to take place elsewhere, the SPRFMO, like other RFMOs, cannot divorce itself from the imperatives of reducing the size of the world fishing fleet and eliminating the unfair distortions created by subsidies of both shipbuilding and fuel costs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for your presentation and for your leadership in SPRFMO. Despite its short history, SPRFMO, one of the newest RFMOs in the world, maybe the newest, has demonstrated that it is possible to break new ground, to change business as usual, to come up with innovative solutions. And our final speaker, Professor Urrutia. Osvaldo, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. Before beginning, I would like to take this opportunity to thank especially the organizers for this invitation as the director of the Law of the Sea Institute, the Office, the Foreign Ministry's division for the environment. And also, of course, I would like to thank the fact that my dear students are present here, and also my friends that have come today to join this effort for the conservation and protection of the oceans.
Please allow me to continue my presentation in English. So, the message that I would like to convey this afternoon is quite simple. In the context of the implementation of UNCLOS, and in the context of the implementation of the Fish Stock Agreement and the work of Regional Fisheries Management Organization, RFMOs, we need to take stronger actions against IUU fishing, but in particular against unregulated fishing activities, as they are a threat to the good governance of our oceans. So in my presentation, I will attempt to identify some changes in state practice that might lead or might identify these changes. And I will try to make a judgment, or at least give an opinion whether these are constructive and positive changes, and what is the importance of these changes. So if you look at this as the first slide, it is in very simple words. What I'm trying to say here is that the Fish Stock Agreement should not be read in isolation from other developments in the law of the sea of the last 15 years. And in particular, I'm referring to the work of the General Assembly under the United Nations resolution, in particular the Sustainable Fisheries Resolution. Also, the FAO Plan of Action against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing of 2001, and also the FAO Port State Agreement of 2009, which I hope will be enforced very soon. So, when you read all these legal documents, when you read this treaty law, what are the conclusions that we can extract from here? The ideas that you can see on the second slide is pretty much that, on the one hand, we have the definition of Article 8.4 and 17 of the Fish Stock Agreement. There is a principle, there are an important principle there, enshrined in this agreement. Only parties to RFMOs may fish in areas regulated by RFMOs. If you take now the IPOA, IUU fishing plan, the illegal fishing plan of action of 2001, and also definition of the Port State Measures Agreement, it says that illegal fishing, IUU fishing, are three different concepts, right? Illegal, unreported, but also unregulated fishing activities. But I want to stop on the last U of this definition, the unregulated fishing activities. This means, according to this definition, fishing in an RFMO area by vessels without nationality, or, this is a part that I wanted to highlight, by those vessels flying the flag of a state not party to that organization, which is obviously a clear link between the Fish Stock Agreement and the IPOA FAO Plan of Action Against Illegal Fishing. So the conclusion is the one you can read at the bottom of the orange circle. Therefore, states parties to the Fish Stock Agreement or RFMOs should not tolerate at all unregulated fishing activities. So let me now go to the next slide. The importance of this is that perhaps states out there are changing their behavior. Perhaps there are some state practice that is possible to identify by virtue of which they show that they do not tolerate unregulated activities. In my opinion, there are at least 4. When you look at RFMOs and the work of states in the context of the Fish Stock Agreement and RFMOs, 4 behaviors are possible to identify. The first one is the IUU listing and its consequences. Several RFMOs have an IUU list. And if you look at the state practice, many of them have included explicitly fishing vessels fly in a state which are not party to the relevant RFMO. This, to me, points to a clear change in behavior that the last EU in IUU fishing, unregulated fishing activities, are not tolerated by the relevant RFMO. The second one is the regulation of transshipment. Transshipment is, of course, a legal activity, but it can also be an open window, an open door for IUU activities. So they need to be regulated. And the state practice in relevant RFMOs and in the context of the Fish Stock Agreement means to me that now, and it's possible to identify, that transshipments are considered an activity that should be regulated. And if a transshipment activity is undertaken by a fishing vessel flag in a state which is not party to the relevant RFMO, it should also be considered as IUU fishing. Let me give you an example. This is the famous Lafayette, the Daman-Saihao. Now it's called the Daman-Saihao. It's flagged to Peru, but years ago it was flagged to Russia. The interesting part is in between. This vessel was flagged into Mongolia. Now we're getting to the point of flag of convenience, right? If you look at the deliberation of the last meeting of the SPREFMA Commission this year in Auckland, to me at least, my reading is that the fact that this vessel was flagged in a flag of convenience in Mongolia and that the vessel did carry activities in the SPREFMA area was enough to put it on the list. And that to me means an important change. It's a huge vessel, isn't it? More than 220 meters length and 35-meter width. It's a real monster. Now it's in Peru, still docked. Let me go to the third activity that I would like to point out. Port access and port use regulations. Several countries are taking measures to control access to their ports. And Chile is a very good example in this matter. Chile has a strong policy by a supreme decree, and now confirmed by the policy signed by President Bachelet yesterday, by virtue of which only those fishing vessels that are flagged in a country which is part of the relevant RFMO can enter into Chilean ports. So unregulated fishing is not tolerated by Chile. And finally, let me please go to the perhaps most sensitive issue. This is the Kunlun. The Kunlun is a illegal fishing which operates regularly in the Southern Ocean, in Antarctic waters, regulated by the CAMELAR. But it also operates in the high seas adjacent to the CAMELAR area. That is the Sosticus, a toothfish, a very expensive and valuable catch. This picture was taken by a New Zealand patrol from afar. The New Zealand vessel tried to inspect and get on board the vessel. Unfortunately, it couldn't because of weather conditions. But the most interesting point to me is that this vessel at that time was flagging Equatorial Guinea, which is obviously a flag of convenience. No matter what, New Zealanders attempted to board and inspect the vessel. Something similar happened with the Perlon, another conspicuous part of the Six Bandits, as they are called in the CAMELAR waters. The Perlon was inspected and boarded by Australian patrol authorities, as you can see in the pictures at the bottom. Unfortunately, the vessel was allowed to continue to port, and it was finally detained in Thailand. Is this all important? What is the meaning of all these changes in state practice? In my opinion, there is important. There is an importance, very clear to me, and what is this? If you consider that the Fish Stock Agreement and states members to our FMOs are growing up in numbers, almost 83 for the Fish Stock Agreement, and other relevant states, fishing states, are also part of our FMOs, that state practice is relevant. If you also bear in mind that international law of the sea is obviously an area in which customary law has had real implications throughout history. If you consider the last four progresses, the four areas in which I have attempted to identify changes, it's clear to me that at least we can ask this question to ourselves. Can we say that an emerging principle of international customary law is emerging? An emerging rule of international law by virtue of which the international community should not tolerate any more unregulated activities with no exception? This is the question. Perhaps it's too soon to say yes or no, but at least something is going on out there that we should take care of, take note, and foster. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Osvaldo. Something is definitely going on out there. And you're right, the Fish Stocks Agreement cannot be read in isolation. And I said at the outset that sustainable fisheries requires collaboration among governments, the fishing industry, civil society, other stakeholders, and I would now add international lawyers too. We have, after all, produced a complex set of international agreements, hard law and soft law, some global, some regional, that together give us the tools we need to manage fisheries effectively. What we have lacked, I think, is an awareness of how important it is to actually follow these rules, to use them, and to be creative in doing so. I actually think the tide is turning. Something is going on out there. Conferences like this certainly help us. We have a number of announcements to make. Please, let's have the lights. I need to call on two people if they're here. The first is Mr. Julian Reyna, Secretary General of the Permanent Commission of the South Pacific. Here. Yes, sir. Please, the microphone for the gentleman.
Hola.
Thank you, Your Highness, Foreign Minister, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Permanent Commission of the South Pacific that coordinates the policies of Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, I thank the government of Chile for the invitation to this very important conference, Our Ocean 2015. Yesterday we heard some speakers ask, for example, of the economic, financial, and banking sector within the same surrounding. And also we heard the Foreign Minister, Heraldo Muñoz, speaking of the decision by the government of Chile to create the Chilean Oceanic Council and an integrated ocean policy for Chile. And today we've heard His Highness Prince Charles in his concern for ensuring a healthy marine environment for his grandchildren, but absolutely clear that development cannot be slowed. And later, Reinaldo Piñones spoke to us of the Thomas Theorem and was involving society, philosophy, policy, and science that we've heard so often. All of this is a very good message to make us think that our first approach to our oceans for its care and conservation and sustainable development must be integral, comprehensive, and include the various factors that influence its health. And that is why this organization has decided to take this strategic leap ahead, to study the option of developing the first integrated oceanic regional policy, for which it will be holding a workshop in Bogota, Colombia from October 28th through 30th this year, with the support of UNEP, IAS from Germany, HIRI from France, and participation by more than 30 experts from the region and the world who put forward the first inputs for such a policy, integrated oceanic regional policy, that later on we're hoping to be able to share with you in another situation such as this one, as a new opportunity, a pioneering form of sustainable integrated management for our southeastern Pacific Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reyna, for that important announcement. Now I'd like to call on my friend, Ambassador Angus Friday of Grenada. Sir.
Ambassador Bolton, many thanks. His Serene Highness, Ministers, Excellencies, Hermanos y Hermanas. Firstly, Grenada takes this opportunity to thank Chile and Minister Heraldo Munoz for hosting us. And secondly, we wish to thank the United States and the Department of State for their extraordinary leadership on oceans, in particular under the stewardship of Secretary John Kerry. Grenada is pleased to announce that it will be hosting a global Blue Growth Investment and Partnership Conference to be held in Grenada in April of 2016. This builds on our partnership with the government of the Netherlands, which we announced at the Global Ocean Action Summit held in The Hague last year. Already, we are working with the World Bank, FAO, and others towards this. This conference will be very pragmatic in nature and will help ocean states, ocean communities, and entrepreneurs get access to public and private partners and also to innovative finance, all with a view to building natural capital while improving food security and livelihoods. To ensure investment readiness, we hope to work with a number of countries and entrepreneurs in the lead-up to this conference, and indeed with many, many more attending the conference. The outcomes of this conference, we hope, will include partnerships and deals that actually move the needle on ocean health and ocean wealth. We really see these as useful inputs into the next Our Oceans conference, and indeed to the follow-up and review of SDG 14, which is scheduled to take place in Fiji in 2017. Thank you, Ambassador.
And thank you, Ambassador, and I look forward to seeing all of you in beautiful Grenada. I have a couple of announcements of my own, so I'm going to stand up. Osvaldo said we should no longer tolerate unregulated fishing. Yesterday, Secretary Kerry mentioned that earlier this year, 5 nations signed a declaration aimed at preventing unregulated fishing from starting in an area there has never been any fishing, in the high seas portion of the Central Arctic Ocean. I'm announcing here now that later this year, the United States will convene a broader set of nations with the goal of transforming this declaration into a binding agreement, yes, to prevent unregulated fishing from starting in the Central Arctic Ocean. That's announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, while we have been here talking about the oceans, and even talking about the problem of subsidies to the fisheries sector that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. Thank you, Bill. Elsewhere in the world, nations who have been involved in developing the Trans-Pacific Partnership have finalized that agreement. And yes, there are aspects of that agreement that relate to fisheries, and the fisheries subsidies issue in particular. Previously, my government and others have committed not to provide subsidies that contribute to excess fishing capacity and overfishing. And today we will announce, consistent with the TPP, of course, that we, also New Zealand, commit not to provide subsidies to vessels, enterprises, or operators engaged in IUU fishing, and we certainly encourage all other governments to make that same commitment. Thank you. And as I had hoped, we have some time left over, and I would like now to open the floor to you for questions, comments, panel, to me. Any takers, please? Don't be bashful. Yes, please. Microphone.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon to all authorities in the room and the entire audience, the speakers as well. I will ask. My question is in relation to what was mentioned. By Professor Andrés Cuve. In relation to the civil population, what specific measures have been adopted in relation to the elements that you mentioned for effective implementation of the treaty? Consider that it was ratified by Chile. Yesterday. So what measures in relation to the civil population, what measures were adopted?
Gracias. Muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you about that of the professor. I was a professor for many years, but not exactly in international law. But let me answer. The New York Agreement was ratified by a great majority in Congress and was enacted by the President of the Republic yesterday and will come into effect once the document is handed in a few days more, and then you have a little time longer for this to actually come into effect. Nevertheless, the principles enshrined in this agreement have in practice already existed since 1905, and they become effective based on this framework agreement through the regional fisheries organizations, these RFMOs. They have the attributions to manage these resources through an array of measures, and those, yes, we are already applying them, and they do have a repercussion in the what you call the civilian population, and these it is citizens involved in the fishing activities related to that area, including artisanal fishermen, trade, universities, everything related to fishing activities. And so you can rest at ease that not because we had not ratified the New York Agreement earlier, it's not that we have not been taking or adopting measures in line with that agreement and according to the provisions set forth in the Straddling Stocks Agreement for the South Pacific.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I think we can all agree he certainly looks like a professor. We have another question from the audience. Yes, sir, please.
Bueno, buenas tardes. ¿Se escucha bien? Buenas tardes a los expositores.
Good afternoon. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our government for organizing this very important conference. And my question is for Andrés Cuve. I apologize if I have not pronounced your surname properly. Considering the coming into effect of that same agreement in 1995, what should be the relationship between the Convention party states and the party states of RFMOs in relation to other states that are not party to the agreement, those who are not complying with the provisions contained in that agreement, and specifically in the case of Chile and other party member or member states What could be a more severe attitude against these countries that are not abiding these rules? Well, thank you for that question. Fortunately, there are each day less and less of those countries, and our efforts should be focused on getting the list to be non-existent. But there are some who are full members of the New York Agreement, the Straddling Stocks Agreement, as well as the RFMOs. But there are also states that are they're cooperation states, but not contracting states or party states. And so they're complying with the rules and regulations, but they do not pay their fees. And when you say this, and they do not have a right to vote. But you're referring to other countries that are within the international legal framework for the compliance of certain norms. And there are other countries that are not part of the New York Agreement, nor any regional organization. And those countries, some of them, are governed by what is called the flag state. The country pursues the ships that carry that flag and ensure that they comply with the provisions that they have a party to. But there are others that are simply pirate ships, and those, they do exist. As we've heard yesterday, there are ships that have no IAS, they do not have any ID instrument, and when they think that they can be checked, they turn it off. But there are each time less of them, and we must combat them. However, right now we have far better tools, each time more tools. We have e-tools to detect them, and also the international community is each day more severe in their persecution of these vessels.
Yes, please. Next question.
Thank you. For Mr. Mansfield, do you think that coast states should have a special and more influent role in the South Pacific governance and in general in the regional fishing management organizations? And in particular case of the South Pacific Ocean, do you see a special part there for countries like Chile, New Zealand, or Australia?
Can we have a microphone, please, for Bill Mansfield?
Thank you. Well, I think the coastal states do have a very important role. In particular, the SPRFMO provides that with the express consent of a coastal state, the decisions of a commission can have an effect in relation to the setting of a catch, for example, in jack mackerel. So Chile has given its express consent, but it does it on a year-by-year basis, and it's entirely up to Chile whether it will allow that process to continue. That is a huge advantage because, as I was saying, you can't really manage a straddling stock unless you can bring these distant water fishes into the management process. So I hope I'm kind of answering your question that really what we've seen, and I suppose one of the motivations for beginning the negotiations on the SPRFMO is that as the Northern Hemisphere countries depleted their waters, then inevitably, and I think some of us saw this, they were going to be coming down south and starting to be depleting the waters nearby. Those waters would affect the waters of the coastal state, in particular a country like Chile with a straddling stock that's very important to it. So critical to have the coastal states in an arrangement where they can work together and have an organisation where they can jointly tackle any country that is predating their stocks and these waters without proper regulation. That, I think, is the real benefit of the SPRFMO. It is a strategic instrument that enables the coastal states of the Pacific to manage properly those resources into the future, because the distant water fishing countries have an obligation either to become party to it or to cooperate with its rules.
Thank you, Bill. Are there any other questions for the items? Yes, ma'am.
For Ms. Gabrielle. My question has to do with the negotiations for a new binding agreement that is just about to start, the process called Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ. What is the role of the United Nations here, and what do you think should be a reasonable outcome of this process?
That's a great question.
Thank you for that very good question. The General Assembly, in its resolution 69-62, actually decided to set up a preparatory committee, which will begin its work next year. And that preparatory committee has been tasked with to develop draft elements of an internationally legally binding instrument under UNCLOS. And the preparatory committee will meet next year and 2017, at which point it will then present its outcome to the General Assembly. Clearly, this is a process that is in the hands of the member states of the United Nations. The meeting will be open not only to member states, but also intergovernmental organizations and also non-governmental organizations that have consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. So we, the Secretariat, will be assisting that meeting and providing as best we can, but clearly it's a highly political process, and I won't speculate at this point, sitting up here. But thank you for that question.
So I am going to exercise some discretion as a moderator to provide a little further answer if you wish. There are two basic questions this negotiation will need to tackle. One has to do with ways to strengthen the conservation rules to better protect biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Are there some stronger rules that can be adopted and implemented for this purpose, including perhaps rules for creating marine protected areas in areas beyond national jurisdiction, or conducting environmental impact reviews of human activities in these areas? These are some of the questions to be discussed. The other part of the agenda relates to genetic material from organisms that exist in areas beyond national jurisdiction, some of which it may be possible to use for commercially available products, biotech products, pharmaceutical products, cosmetic products. A question that has been presented is, should there be some benefit sharing system put in place relating to this genetic material taken from areas beyond the jurisdiction of any nation? That is not an easy question, but it is one that will be part of this negotiation as well. But like Abby, I do not intend to speculate about what the outcome will or even should be. These are hard questions. Do we have time for more? Yes, another question, ma'am, please.
Thank you. I would like to ask Professor Urrutia, or whoever could introduce us to something that concerns me as a deputy of the Republic, especially representing this fifth region, and that is trawler fishing. We were speaking about those things that should be regulated or the things that should not happen. How can we address this issue of trawler fishery in large ships and artisanal fishing? This is a matter of concern to us, because those of us who need to legislate, we need to address the large corporations versus the small entrepreneurs, and often they do not always have laws to protect their rights. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. A microphone, please, for Professor Urrutia.
I think that you have to finish the panel now, because...
Thank you for your question, Deputy. This is a sensitive issue, and we cannot deny that it is being discussed today. I'm going to give you a personal opinion that it represents no one but me. There are two types of trawler fishery. One is bottom trawling, and that should be greatly regulated, in some places even banned. But it is a criteria that was adopted at the UN General Assembly, and that criteria should be implemented by all countries, and in Chile it has been implemented under the fisheries law. That is one thing. And then regarding the mid-water trawling, I think that is different, because using a certain degree of selectivity, it can be used, and I think that to a certain extent it could be quite selective, but using the correct technology available today. And but of course, I repeat, this is a totally personal opinion and represents no one else.
I want to make sure his answer is recorded clearly in the minutes of the meeting. Yes, we have time for another question, please.
Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Alejandro Covarrubias, soy jefe de Asuntos Internacionales del Servicio Nacional de Pesca de Chile. Pero quiero hacer un anuncio, si me permite, en nombre de la Red Internacional de Monitoreo, Control y Vigilancia, a la cual me han pedido que los represente en su Washington. Esta red fue formada en el año 2000 a una solicitud de Chile en la conferencia la primera conferencia que se hizo en Chile del monitoreo, control y vigilancia para implementar el código de conducta para la pesca responsable. En esta ocasión, la idea propuesta por Chile fue acogida y 5 países, Estados Unidos, Australia, Perú, la Comunidad Europea y bajo el auspicio de FAO,
under the
Chile,
auspices
formamos
of
esta
FAO in Chile, we formed this organization. This organization is not binding, it is totally voluntary. And groups, services, and state institutions responsible for controlling and inspecting fishing. Today, we group 60 countries who voluntarily meet to do joint fishing surveillance. I would like to announce is that this organization that goes back 15 years now, as I say, it is totally voluntary, has held 4 international global workshops with the participation of more than 60 to 70 countries. And in March 2016, it will organize its 5th World Conference in Auckland, New Zealand, under the auspices of the government of New Zealand. And with the greetings of the President, we would like to invite countries to send their technical experts and their inspectors, because this is the only place that groups together all inspectors worldwide to talk about control, inspection, and surveillance. It is a technical meeting where we talk about strategies, joint work, technology, ways of controlling and inspecting, and this is the time to touch on an issue that has been mentioned during this conference. What we need is to create capacity building. One way of doing this is by attending and working with the organizations that do fishing, control, inspection, and surveillance around the world. Thank you.
Alejandro, thank you. Thank you very much for your work with the International MCS Network. I see sitting near you Michelle Carrick. Thank you for your work you used to do too. Yesterday, Secretary Kerry announced a new initiative called Sea Scout, and I commend to you the following question. Is it possible for this new initiative, Sea Scout, to work together with the International MCS Network to improve monitoring, control, and enforcement with respect to fisheries worldwide? Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this panel. We have also come, almost, to the end of our conference. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists and all of the students and other participants here today. I spoke too soon. I am told we have one more question and time for just that. I am sorry. Please.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. I would like to ask you a question. The fact that you are part of the fish stock agreement, does this oblige the state to implement regulations compatible with the ORP, or should this be understood that they're merely doing their duty, and so that they can act in an otherwise unregulated way?
Sorry, are you asking about the relationship between the Fish Stocks Agreement and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea?
My question has to do with Article 7 of the Fish Stock Agreement in relation to compatible measures. And in that sense, if a coastal state applies measures compatible to a RFMO working in high seas, could this be understood as though they're complying with their cooperation duty, and so that they're acting in a regulated way and not seen as a state that is acting in an unregulated way?
Okay, now I understand your question. So I wrote Article 7 of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. But I'm not sure I know the answer to your question. Article 7, for those who may not know, requires there to be compatibility in the way a fish stock is managed within areas under national jurisdiction, and that same stock being managed in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The idea is that there should be compatible measures applicable to a given stock throughout its range. The question you are asking is a difficult one, and I'm not sure there is a good answer available yet today. I see Foreign Minister Munoz has arrived, and now I really will draw this panel to a conclusion. Let me ask you once again to join me in thanking our distinguished panelists, and I look forward to seeing all of you again soon. Thank you.